Hola, and welcome to Vive Nutrition Radio, the first ever Spanglish podcast where you will hear interviews with the top minds in nutrition, performance, fitness, and health in both English and Spanish. Here is your host, expert registered dietitian, Andres Ayesta, on a mission to help you take your nutrition to the next level. Hope you're ready for this. Let's dive right in.
All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Vive Nutrition Radio. This is your host, Andres, and as I introduced my guest today on the podcast earlier, I didn't tell her, but then I usually do a cool introduction prior to this recording. I have the pleasure to have my friend and colleague, also registered dietitian and meat scientist, Livi Ron, on the podcast today. How are you, Livi, this morning?
I am wonderful. I am so happy to be here.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was super excited to have a conversation with you because I think I remember we met probably in January in Tony Steffen's mentorship program. And I think the first thing that I remember from you saying, and one of the things that you said was, we're talking about, who you work with and, your background and everything. And you said, I'm a meat scientist. And I'm like, holy shit. I was like, I heard of that, but I actually never met somebody that does this. And it's like, yeah, I'm working on my PhD and all kinds of stuff like this. And I'm like, cool. So I think obviously we're going to talk a lot about meat today, of course, because people are saying probably like, wow, like this, I want to hear what this person has to say. But why don't we enlighten us a little bit more with your background and what kind of led the path for you to become a registered dietitian, and also how you became interested in specifically studying and getting your PhD, if I'm correct, on meat sciences and things like that.
So actually, becoming a registered dietitian was an afterthought. I never even really thought I wanted to become a registered dietitian. It wasn't until my major professor in grad school was like, hey, I know you're like focusing on meat, but it's really smart if you wanted to, go be a dietitian as well and do a dual path master's. I never had any desire to become an RD, honestly. Crazy story. I started undergrad and I wanted to be a veterinarian. I've been riding horses my entire life, and I thought I wanted to go to school and be a horse vet. So it was like my sophomore, junior year, and I realized how expensive vet school was, and how the money wasn't really great, and I didn't really want to work with small animals, and it was hard to get into large animal. And I had been taking tons of meat science, livestock management, like carcass classes, just understanding, because you have to take classes on every basically livestock species when you're in animal science undergrad. And I decided, you know what, it's really interesting how many people don't understand where their food comes from. And I developed a strong, deep fire for meat science and teaching people where their food comes from and like how we're not trying to poison people at the end of the day. So I ended up getting a master's in meat science and microbiology, and then I dual passed master's in nutrition and dietetics, and then I went on to get a PhD. And I just, I'm so passionate about teaching people about food, where their food comes from, and the reasons behind why we do everything. Because we don't just do things haphazardly. There's a scientific reason behind every single thing that we do in animal agriculture.
Nice. And I think we can probably kind of start the conversation, now that you mentioned the whole thing about like your meat, like background and how you kind of got into it in muscle biology, which obviously is a very controversial topic nowadays in our food industry. I feel like nowadays there's obviously like the love-hate relationship on meat in the meat industry. You have obviously the keto carnivore community, which are super pushing into like on a good side, like, okay, like, you need to increase meat consumption and obviously all that kind of stuff. But then on the other side, you have vegan, vegetarian community who are saying basically that not only meat is some of like the drama, the dramatism that around it is like, meat is going to kill you, to all other things such as, the environmental footprint and things like that. So I guess like we can probably, because we can take this conversation in many different directions, but why don't we start by just maybe kind of covering some of like the typical myths that you hear most often around, meat consumption. And I have some, but I want to hear more because I know you kind of have more first-hand experience into hearing some of the craziest things out there as far as like meat consumption. So what are like maybe three?
For me, interesting because they say less than 2% of people today are actually involved in animal agriculture right now, in any sort of actually raising the animal themselves. So it's so easy for us to be swayed by marketing, packaging. It's so easy for us to not really know because we're not really exposed to it anymore. Like, you don't see cattle roaming around Tampa, like it just isn't a thing. So, and same thing, I live downtown Chicago now. Even though Chicago used to be the main hub of animal agriculture, the Chicago stockyards, the huge thing that was like, helped, support the country in terms of animal agriculture being right on Lake Michigan, and the river was great for transporting animals. There was a huge Chicago livestock exposition every year.
Like,
and
where
now
the city is right now? Like where the city
downtown.
Wow.
Like if you Google Chicago stockyards, literally there was pens and pens and pens of animals. And the three major slaughterhouses were in Chicago. And the book The Jungle was actually written about working conditions, about working in a slaughterhouse in downtown Chicago. And that's what actually triggered a lot of kind of regulations around how to properly have sanitary food. And that happened, that started in 1906 is when that kind of started. But Chicago stockyards existed until 1950. So pretty much around the time that our grandparents and our parents, depending on how old your parents are, were alive. So it's interesting to think about how not that long ago, there were literal sheep, cattle, chickens running in the streets of Chicago.
Wow.
It's a huge part of the history that no one really knows because I'm in my WeWork building looking at, the Sears Tower. But, I just understanding that agriculture used to be everywhere and now we're just so far removed. But I would say some of the biggest things is whenever I see hormone-free poultry or hormone-free pork or antibiotic-free anything. It's really hard for me to see that because I think it's just constant fear-mongering about how, and giving food morality, right? Like this food is better than this food, and you're a better person if you eat this food, and you're a better mother if you feed your kid this food. And not really, it's hard for me to see because the USDA absolutely does not allow the use of hormones in pork or poultry. A lot of people are like, well, what about this video? And they're showing, I was like, again, the USDA does not allow the use of hormones in pork or poultry. We've done extensive research and we showed that, there's no purpose to be wasting money for us to use that. So there's no reason why we do that. And then people say, well, why are these chickens so big? And I'm like, well, if you took a 6'7" man and a 6'6" woman and they had a child, they'd probably have a very large child. So through tons of selective breeding, we pick chickens that have the largest breast tissue and breast muscle, and then have continued to breed them and have elite breeding stock to make elite offspring.
Wow.
It's kind of the same thing. It's a question I ask
myself because sometimes I ask myself how are these and I want to ask you about that because I never heard of that term before, selective breeding. Because I've been to places, sometimes whether it's Walmart, Trader Joe's, whatever, and I do see that there are obviously this small little piece of chicken that sometimes tend to be even sometimes more expensive for some reason. Because I also want to ask you about the cost associated with this stuff and how they price this versus obviously this big humongous chicken breast, which I'm like, I want to go for this one. But then there's that thought process lingering in my mind is what are they feeding these things and what are they feeding these chickens that make them so cheap but at the same token also so large. So what is the concept of selective breeding and I guess you kind of you mentioned it, but then how is that associated whenever, for example, a shopper is trying to buy poultry, for example?
So we breed these chickens to be very large, right? Because and especially when I get to beef, that's my main area of expertise. But when it comes to poultry, we want to be able to raise the animals in the shortest amount of time because if they are alive for a shorter period of time, they're drinking less water, they're eating less food, they're using less resources. So ultimately, it's better for the environment if we don't have them living for extended periods of time. So we want to have these animals to grow and develop at a somewhat fast pace The way we do that is by breeding large chickens with large chickens and continuously breeding large chickens with large chickens. The same reason why, like pugs, like a dog, those didn't exist naturally. Those happen as a result of selective breeding, right? Like all these designer dogs that we have. The reason they have like all these like crazy dogs out there is because we bred them to be that way. Same thing with chickens, right? We can breed really big chickens. Just like you can breed 2 Great Danes and you have a really big Great Dane, you have a really big dog.
Yeah.
Same thing with chickens. You can breed tons of big chickens, you'll have big offspring that create large breast tissue. Also, in a lot of chickens that you'd see that are like the breast actually looks like very large, you'll see in the bottom in there's an asterisk and it'll say enhanced with up to like 12% solution. So they actually pump the chicken breast that you actually buy with water and a little bit of salt. One, to create juiciness, because everyone knows chicken breast like dries out pretty quickly. And, it makes it a little bit cheaper for people who can't really afford. So it helps with juiciness. The salt also helps with keeping it able to be shelf stable a little bit longer because the chicken sits in the meat case for a little bit longer. So salt is a natural, pathogen control. And then it's a better eating experience, honestly. So
interesting. So you say basically, obviously, when you see these like large pieces of poultry, it's like a combination of like the breeding that you're talking about, and also when they read, because like a lot of people think like that 12% solution, because I've seen it, they may start it's strictly what are they injecting in these things? It's just salty water.
No,
it's
literally it's way after slaughter. We literally have chicken breasts and they're going through a line and they go through a multi-needle injector. It usually has 96 needles. And each of the needles have tiny little holes and then it injects it. And then literally chicken breasts are going through and it's just injecting water into the chicken and it just plumps it up.
Now you mentioned the word like the whole hormone conversation, because I feel like that's like a huge, because I see when I go to a supermarket a ton of like, and you said it earlier, hormone free, antibiotic free, and all that stuff. Like, so if it's illegal, so essentially like, you can sell chicken breast if you have hormones added to the mix. So why are people putting this like labeling on their packaging? I'm guessing it's just to lure you into buying it, but is it more than that, or is just literally that's the reasoning?
No, because if you look at anything that is either pork or poultry and it says hormone-free pork or hormone-free poultry, on the very bottom in very, very tiny font, like size 8 sans serif, it will say the USDA does not allow the use of hormones in pork or poultry. It will say that in every single package because people don't know that, right? Because again, less than 2% of people are involved directly in animal agriculture, and whatever these companies' marketing teams know that people want hormone-free pork and poultry, and so they're like, well, we're going to get people to buy this, even though every single piece of chicken, every single piece of pork, any poultry actually, is hormone-free, has to be, it's illegal. And even if people are like, well, I think they're illegally doing it, it's not advantageous for them to do that. So because there's no benefit, the chickens don't grow any faster, get any bigger, and it'd be a waste of money for the processor. So there's really no reason for us to be doing it even illegally. And all the carcasses are tested for like residue. So if there's any hormone residue, antibiotic residue, that carcass is pulled and then usually put in goes to rendering or animal food.
Wow, that's really cool. And I think for people listening in, like you can stop worrying about like, just because you don't need to search for like that hormone free thing because everything is hormone free, technically speaking. So, what about let's talk about red meat, because I know like that's like your biggest area. So you mentioned poultry and pork. Is there like any kind of hormone treatments or anything like that we should be aware of? Because I have a lot of questions specific to meat from like the perspective of the breeding of cattle and all kinds of stuff like this. But on the same token, on like what do they give these animals and what does it depend on that? So let's start off with like the part of hormones. Is there any kind of treatment that cattle needs to be gone through? And then is there a health risk, or is there something that we need to be aware of or worried about as far as this?
Sure. So I, as someone who's like raised conventional beef myself. There's something that a lot of people need. There's, the life cycle of cattle is a lot longer, right? Like 16 to 18 months. So totally different than pigs, chickens that live, relatively less than a year. So these are, not like a few months. So these take a lot longer and they're very large. So there's 3 different kind of systems that we go through. So there's cow-calf, like where the animal is born, to stocker cattle, where they're like, if you're ever driving down like a rural road and you see random cattle just like on the side of the road, those are usually stocker cattle. So they're just kind of growing and, living their life. And then they get put in a feedlot or a finishing system, right? Like 60 to 90 days before slaughter, where they're administered grain. So prior to that 60, 90 days, they've been eating grass, living outside, just living their life, growing until that last 60, 90 days where they're at a feedlot. In that time frame, we usually administer a small implant in their ear, which is an estradiol implant. And the reason we do that is, I don't know if you remember, but like in middle school, when all the girls for a while were taller than all the boys, and then all of a sudden in high school it flips, right, where all the boys are taller than all the girls, because what happens is estrogen kind of tells the body to grow your skeletal system and have it reach mature size at like faster. So we're trying to get all the energy that the cattle are taking in from grain and from grass, everything they're eating, and have it go towards musculature. So if we use an implant to have their skeletal system reach mature size faster, now all the energy that they're consuming can now go to muscle mass, versus have it go, or like just, fat deposition, muscle mass, just size in general, versus the energy going towards growing their skeleton. Because that's not going to help us either way. We don't really care about their skeleton in terms of the size of their skeleton, obviously.
So sorry, go ahead. Like I have a question. So about that specifically, so you're saying that obviously there's like some estrogen sort of like, implanted in like, cattle. Now, does that also, is that like a noticeable amount in like the finished product that we put on our plate? Or is it something that we don't even need to worry about?
No, because what happens is prior to slaughter, any antibiotic, hormone, implant, anything that we give to any sort of animal has to be withdrawn. So everything has a withdrawal period, so there is no hormones or residue in the finished product. There's actually negligible difference between implanted and non-implanted steers in finished product food in terms of estrogen content. You'll find more natural estrogen in beer, cabbage, soy than you'd ever find in beef itself. So the interesting, and same thing with milk, because that's a natural, you're going to be finding estrogen naturally occurring, because think of what milk is, right? It is a hormonal product. So even if with cattle that aren't treated with RBST, there's still going to be hormones in your milk, just naturally occurring because it is a product of lactation. So, but when it comes to talking about beef, there's tons of research out there, and I have a bunch of great infographics that kind of show the difference between implanted and non-implanted beef, and the difference is negligible, not even statistically significant.
Wow, that's really cool, because I feel like, and that's kind of the type of conversation that people are not having, because they just decide to say, well, there's hormones added to a cow. And then immediately they're like, oh, there's just hormones, like, we don't really need to have none of this stuff and all that, but they don't understand exactly the reasoning behind it. And also it's like, there is an environmental reason for that, just because like you don't want the cow to be lingering around for, like months and months, just so they can kind of grow maturity a lot faster. And then we can kind of have more of like a bigger turnaround, correct?
Yes, and the craziest thing is we are actually producing the least amount of cattle since 1950. We have the actual number of animals that are alive is the lowest point since 1950, yet we are producing more meat than ever before because of the use of these technologies. So think about the environmental impact it has by eliminating that many animals. Because all those animals are emitting greenhouse gas, requiring water, feed, they're producing manure, all these things that require, that impact our earth, where we're using these technologies to help them grow faster, produce more actual muscle tissue through selective breeding, the use of periodized and correct usage of growth technologies. and we can reduce our environmental impact. If you have completely grass-fed and finished animals, because number one, all beef is grass-fed, right? So if that's something that's really important to you for whatever reason, make sure it says grass-finished, because like I said, the cow-calf, stocker, finished, cow-calf and stocker, those animals are eating grass. So
it doesn't matter. Like they're not no cows were fed like grain all their lives. So they start off with grass, and then the difference, what you're saying that exists, is whether they're grass finished or grain finished, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they really. You'll say in the packaging typically, but sometimes if it's a really, really cold winter and like you have cattle in North Dakota, you might feed them some grain in the winter just to create some adipose tissue, to protect them against the cold. But for the most part, cattle are eating primarily grass up until they go to a feedlot this last 60 to 90 days of their life. Like, people think cattle live in a feedlot their entire lives, and they don't at all. So, and it's interesting because that's another thing where cattle are herd animals. If you ever see them when you're driving by the road, they're always in clumps. You'll never really see like one by itself because they're animals of prey. So like when the USDA has a minimum space requirements for each animal, and even when you see them in a feedlot, they're still clumped together. They all want to always be together. So everyone's like, well, all these cattle need open range and free space, and we personify them, right? We give them human-like characteristics, and without understanding the actual animal behavior that is intrinsic to them, where they actually want to be in close clumps. So the whole big open space actually makes them very easily hunted and makes them nervous. So being in smaller spaces, through all these studies that we've done, where we've actually monitored like heart rate on different animals, and like seeing like how their heart rate trends when they're in different environments, you can actually see that the cattle are more calm when they're in closer, more confined spaces, which leads to why we have certain methods when we like slaughter, when we go to like animal slaughter, the way that animals walk up to the ramp and like do certain things, all to make them feel close and safe, because stress prior to slaughter affects meat quality, which affects the way that people get paid.
And these are standards that are set like basically by USDA, essentially for like, where cattle is grown and all these different things. Or I guess the question also, it's like, what kind of like, in the agriculture business and these ranchers, like what makes them different, like one ranch from the other? Like, if they're following specific and strict standards by USDA, as far as like growing and the breeding and all these different things of their animals, what makes, for example, like a very expensive, and not necessarily cuts, because I know certain cuts of beef are going to be more expensive, but, from one specific maybe brand or from one specific kind of like, place versus the other? Is it some things that the ranchers have more leeway to do, like to make it more of a premium type of, offering that they have, or what is like kind of like the difference that exists between them?
So it's kind of what I would say compared to is like kind of like the difference in supplements, right? There are some supplements that are like really, really like highly known, and there are some that aren't, and like there are different prices. And just think about like whey, right? There are probably 500 different companies that are making whey. That's all relatively the same. Some of them just have more flavor. Some of them say that they have more BCAA. Some of them say whatever. But at the end of the day, it's all whey. So when it comes to beef, there are different marketing systems, right? Like certified Angus beef means that it's a certain quality grade. And that's a really big thing that drives price, is because there's a big difference between quality and inspection. So beef quality and beef inspection are very different things. Like all beef has to be inspected by a USDA inspector, right? You have to have a USDA inspector at, and even like further process plants. So even after the animal's been slaughtered and you're just receiving meat products, there has to be a USDA inspector watching how people are handling meat at any part of the process, as well as there has to be a USDA inspector and a veterinarian on site at the slaughter facility, in case an animal is actually injured, can't get off the trailer, whatever happens, like there has to be a veterinarian there whatsoever. Absolutely has to be there. But grading comes when you're looking at carcasses coming through on the line, you're grading them, USDA, select, choice, or prime. So obviously everyone has heard of like prime beef, this like high, it's very high quality, and the amount of intramuscular fat within the actual muscle itself. So that's a very different thing versus, the like inspected just means it's safe and like to eat. Where all beef has to be inspected, not all beef has to be graded. Mm-hmm. So like CAB, like certified Angus beef, is in the top 2/3 choice. So it's either like high choice or prime, so that there's something people know, like, oh, Angus beef is better for you. There's like, better eating quality, better eating experience. So there's just, that's a price markup just because of good marketing. Is really what it comes down to. That's
really interesting. I don't think I've ever kind of like heard like the differences that existed between those, and I've seen them before, and I know like it really drives like the pricing of all of it. So that's really cool to information for people to know, especially when they're actually going through the purchasing kind of like process and trying to select different kinds of beef. So it all comes down to essentially that kind of like inspection process and essentially determining the quality based on the actual animal, from what you're telling me, right?
Well, it comes down to the quality grader, so who's like determining quality, because the inspector is there to make sure they're following USDA protocol, making sure everything is safe, handled properly, that all animal welfare standards are being met. Mm-hmm. That's the inspector. The quality grader is someone who's saying this is choice, this is prime, this is select, this is choice, this is prime, this is select. Awesome. So they have different jobs. Both work for the USDA, different jobs.
Interesting. Now, there's a lot of, besides just meat, because we're talking about actual, like, a piece of steak or something that has like not a whole lot of processing involved. So what happens, and I think obviously this is another bigger misconception that exists, that people sometimes like put red meat or like all meat into like this big conglomerate, and they don't really separate like, the difference that exists between processed and unprocessed meats. So when we're kind of like now talking about processed meats, which we know that there's obviously some studies showing linkages to specific, cancers and stuff like that. And I think this is where a lot of people get some of like their claims as to why we need to reduce it. So what are your thought process on all this, specifically to process versus unprocessed? It's like, people, is it really related to the misconception that there's like the processing part actually makes a difference, or are they all the same? Or what are your kind of like, how do you usually teach your clients and people about the differences that exist between the two?
So for me, honestly, anything that's on your plate is a form of processed meat, right? Like you can't just grab a cow and take no processing, right? We had to slaughter that animal. We had to cut the animal up. We had to make it into steaks. We had to transport that steak. We had to put it in the correct amount of packaging. And all of that is a form of processing. So it's processed and further processed. So even ground beef is considered a further processed item. It has been taken from its original form and changed into something. So even just grinding it, even there's no additives or anything like that on it to ground beef, it's considered a further processed meat. So for me, I think it's really getting clear on what someone is defining as processed meat. Are they saying bacon, sausage, hot dogs, or are they saying ground beef? Because it's a very different thing. And then when I think about processed meats, and the research that was done that correlated processed meats to colorectal cancer and things like that, it was deemed a carcinogen. You look at a lot of the research, and the correlation is really rough. Especially in terms of, there's so many variables. Like, how do you control someone's stress level? If someone is living in a hot, is eating overall like a highly saturated fat diet, isn't eating vegetables, they couldn't control those things. The only variable they can say is, well, that person ate processed meat and now that person has cancer. So just because the person has cancer, we can't necessarily say that it was because of processed meat. So I think that the harder part is being able to understand, the correlation isn't necessarily applicable, and we've had a lot of more research and data come up subsequently, as a result of that, to show that, like, I guess correlation isn't like, or causation isn't correlation, and vice versa. So, but when it comes to processed meats, a lot of the ingredients that we use in processed meats are not something to be scared of. It's crazy. Probably one of the most processed meats, but people think it's healthy, is turkey bacon. Because, for example, bacon is actually a very minimally processed item. It's literally a pork belly sliced into slices after being injected with usually a water, salt, and like a nitrite solution, maybe some seasoning. But it's very, very minimally processed. And where turkey bacon, we have to literally like use different pieces of the turkey, emulsify it, make it into a meat batter, use different parts, put it together, create it into a giant log, slice it. It's a way bigger process, wow. Right? But yeah, someone's going to say, turkey bacon is so much healthier for you. But I'm like, well, it's probably the most processed meat product. But at the end of the day, I'm very pro processed meat. But I still think there's nothing wrong with them in general, especially when it comes to things like nitrites, right? People are really scared of nitrites. They hear all these things about it. But at the end of the day, nitrites are keeping us from getting things like Clostridium botulinum, E. coli, Salmonella, the natural pathogen control. It's naturally found in dark leafy greens. There's nothing wrong with nitrates, and all the research has shown that if you, especially even in rats, to have any sort of carcinogenic effect, you have to have, it was like 3 times their body weight in nitrites for like, it was like 3 years, or like they expanded it, the research to be. It was something absurd. Right. So the poison's in the dose. Right. So I don't think anyone's having a problem with that. And I think processed meats are a great way to get protein in, especially if you're on the go. Like, I think beef jerky as a processed meat, great item. Same thing with, hot dogs are all pre-cooked. So if you're on a road trip and you can't really like stop, and you can be eating hot dogs because they're fully cooked items. Same thing with deli meats. Everything like that, especially all the products that say uncured, but for whatever reason they have, it says in the ingredient label they contain celery juice or celery powder. A lot of people kind of look over that, they don't really understand. But the reason why is because we grow that celery in a high nitrite water, dissolve the celery, and then add it and turn it into a powder and add it to the product. So the product is still containing nitrites, even though it says uncured, because it contains celery powder. So, because we still want to keep people safe from getting things like Clostridium botulinum, which will kill you. Wow. So, at the end of the day, it's pretty bad deceptive marketing, and people buying into it, and people paying a lot of money for it. Like if you look at uncured bacon versus regular Hormel or whatever bacon, there's probably a $2 upcharge on the uncured bacon when they both contain nitrate.
That makes a big difference. That's kind of crazy because, I think, and I'm to blame to actually sometimes buy some of those products like that because, again, a lack of education on not necessarily understanding, how some of this stuff is working, and I think it makes a huge difference in the process. So, thank you so much for definitely sharing that. I think a lot of people got a lot of really good takeaways from for today, and I feel like there's a lot of more applicable things that we can definitely do in this process. Awesome. So I think, like I said, there's a lot of big takeaways that we have here, and if I was to be able to kind of summarize them, so the first thing that you mentioned is, first of all, people don't have a true understanding of really what entails to raise cattle, and that's the one of the first things about it. Every single cow in America is fed grass, most of them, with some of them sometimes in winter times being fed some grain during the very first stages of their life. It's the difference that exists is more what they're actually being fed at the very end of their lifetime before their slaughter, which in that case is going to be what the terminology is, grass fed, grass finish or grain finish. Correct? That's kind of the main thing about that. As far as poultry, every single piece of chicken that you put in your plate in here is hormone free. It's illegal to put hormones in poultry, and just because something says hormone free in the label, it's kind of purely a marketing tactic just to make sure that you buy a piece of chicken that's probably 3 times more expensive, right? Okay.
Correct.
That's the important part. And then I think as far as like, the bigger also takeaway that I got from like the part of like processed meats is like, you don't have to fear them. It's kind of like, it's putting things into perspective from what you're saying. Like, if you obviously have all kinds of processed meats, like, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, maybe not like the smartest idea, but it's more about looking at your entire nutrition and your entire thing as a whole. And a lot of times people don't really see that. They just tend to kind of focus on one specific area. Like if you eat this piece of processed meats right now, you're going to get cancer. But they're not looking if you get like vegetables and all these different things, from that perspective. So I think that kind of summarizes everything. Anything else that you kind of wanted to add that you feel like people really need to take away from all this?
Yeah, just, understanding that every ingredient or everything that we do is a chemical, right? And to stop fearing like chemicals or stop fearing ingredients and stop fearing science, because I have people telling me like, well, like that's just not the way animals are meant to be raised, and that's, they're not meant to be raised in confinement or this or that. And I would always come back and say there's a lot of reasons why we do certain things. Plus, raising animals, I guess, quote unquote, with air quote, traditionally, like what you think, like Ronald McDonald with his farm and outside of staff and just, cattle and pigs roaming around in a field, that doesn't really feed 9 billion people. So at the end of the day, we have to think about how we're going to feed everyone in this world and with the less impact on the environment.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. I think I was having a conversation the other day with some reports that I've actually seen like the environmental repercussions of like meat consumption. And then they were saying basically that if we today in America would completely eradicate every single head of cattle, like right now, it would only account for maybe like a 2% like difference.
Correct.
In environmental footprint of meat consumption in the US. So when you start to look at that, it's like, does it really make a difference? Especially when we're trying to sustain a population worldwide that continues to expand over like 67 billion nowadays. So can we live without meat? Like can this, I guess the question, to ponder on is like, can this society survive without any kind of meat in the world? And I mean, I don't know, like I think you would say like possibly, but then it just, or maybe not. Like that's like the thing that I feel like, at this point we're kind of like in that conversation.
Yeah, so when I was in grad school, we had a bunch of grad students who actually did a bunch of research in children in West Africa who didn't have any meat and were malnourished, right? They're in West Africa. And we basically introduced the ability to feed them goats. Because goats they can live on plants. I swear to God, you can feed those things anything and they survive. They're very hardy. They're very resistant to drought. They can eat not that much food and stay alive and be fine. They're really good at high heat conditions, so they're great for Africa, and they're a red meat, right? So very, very high in iron. So we know that the grad students basically did research on looking at the children's behavior, aggression, test scores, their ability to stay awake and play, and notice that all these children, when they first started, were very aggressive, weren't able to focus in school, had a hard time playing or doing normal children behaviors. And once we started implementing goat meat into their diet, I think it was 2 to 3 times a week, we saw an improvement in test scores, lowered aggression, more natural childlike play behavior, more alertness, more readiness to take on tasks. So it just shows how, just in general, that they were basically meat free because it's so hard for them to, eat meat. And obviously were overly malnourished because they really only had access to rice and maybe some vegetables and legumes, but it was very, very minimal diet. But by just the only thing we changed from their diet was adding in goat meat 2 to 3 times a week, and we saw a drastic reduction in the aggression and increased normal childlike behavior. So for me, I have a really hard time thinking long term that we could sustain as a population without meat. I think there's so much evolutionary data that shows, especially for example, where we'll be able to find B12 is mostly what it comes down to. That's only found in some yeast in small amounts and in every single piece of meat you can consume, as well as heme iron, which is found in red meat. because there's a big difference between non-heme and heme iron. Obviously, I think in the United States, we're very fortunate where we can choose to be vegan or vegetarian, and we can do so by supplementing with necessary supplements and making sure we have a varied diet. And I think that can work for a lot of people. But if we remove ourselves from that situation, we think about people who are actually malnourished and don't necessarily have the option. And like, it's a very different situation, right? Like those children in West Africa aren't able to have garbanzo beans, black beans, soy, tempeh, all these different things, and like a varied diet. So I think it's a very different situation. We have to remember that these kids in West Africa don't have, you know, a grocery store where they can just say, oh, I'm going to eat this Beyond Burger today. You know, it's not the situation.
That's not a possibility for them. Yeah, they're not
right. And so we have to
boxes of that in like Africa. So
no, and we have to think about how the rest of the world lives and kind of remove ourselves from our very fortunate and I'll say sometimes entitled American life. You know, where we can just go to the grocery store, or we're not. Most of us aren't food like in food poverty.
Yeah, I think that's powerful, and I do agree with all that. I feel like, you know, it's looking things into context, and we're looking at like, you know, historical background on this stuff. Like people have hunted and gathered for like, you know, since existence of human, you know, since human existence. So, you know, why do we need to kind of change that now? And I'm always on the side of like, you know, like balance. We're not have to go all the way carnivore and completely take out like all our vegetable intake, or like, you know, the whole keto, like, you know, part of it, and, you know, within, you know, with specific kind of like, you know, medical conditions that there may be some application. But for overall, like us in general population, like, I think it's a combination of everything, and just stop fearing food as much, and just being able to be educated on it before we actually make, I guess, precipitous decisions as far as like, you know, what we put in our bodies. Right. So I think that's a bigger thing. So I usually like to finish up this podcast with what I like to call a rapid fire question session. So this is actually the first thing that comes to mind as soon as I ask it. So you ready for it? Just 4 simple questions. Okay. All right. First question would be, what is your favorite exercise?
Snatch, for sure.
I knew it was going to be some sort of like weightlifting movement. Yeah, for people listening in, if you haven't checked out like Livi's Instagram channel or her social media, she is an avid weightlifter, and you compete still, right? Like, you know, from time to time.
I still do.
Awesome. Yeah. So snatch would be the choice on here. What about a book that everybody should have on their shelves, or that you would gift to most people?
It's called Just Eat It. It's a great book. I'm obsessed with it. I think it's such a great book, just talking about how we can go back to being that 5-year-old kid playing in the sandbox, running in, eating food that tastes good, and then running back out, and not having this like preconceived ideas about like, what should I eat? Like, what is wrong with food? Or like, it kind of just really debunks all diet culture. It's great. It's a phenomenal book.
Who wrote it? Is it Lauren Thomas, you said?
Lauren Thomas, PhD. So it's really well written. Has a bunch of good research in it. I
just made a note in here, so I recommend it. Nice.
Yeah, it's great. It's kind of, I'm a gentle nutrition person, where I have a blend of some people who are more intuitive, some people who track macros. I track macros personally, but it's a great book just to give people more insight on debunking diet culture.
Nice. I love that. Okay, cool. I'm going to make sure I put that and add it up on the show notes so people can go and get it. A podcast or a YouTube channel or something that you watch, you consume content that you feel like you really like to get, research or nutrition information that is something reputable that you would listen to or you would recommend people to listen to.
So I have 2 comments on this. I have one podcast I listen to just for fun because it's hilarious and it's mindless. It cracks me up. And it's called You Up. And it's literally.
I think I've heard of it.
It's literally the letters U and then UP ? It's a man and a woman who talk about like different things about dating and like from a man and a woman's perspective, and it's hilarious. And I definitely listen to it a lot just because it comes out. It's great. But when it comes to research, there's a few that I really like. I'm pulling it up on my phone now. I'm sober, so I don't drink. And so I really like the Soberful podcast. It talks a lot about managing social situations and dealing with like being a sober person. I really like that one. I really like Joe Rogan. I think he has a lot of really great people on there. And I do like Mind Pump. Some of their stuff is a little bit...
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Some of their stuff is a little bit not great, but for the majority, I like a lot of things they say.
Excellent. Love it. I wrote them all down so people can go and check them out. Last question would be, if you were stranded on a deserted island for the rest of your life and you were to choose one food to have for the rest of existence, what would that be?
I probably would choose I would probably choose probably beef.
Yeah.
I just like to think about it. It's very calorically dense. It would keep me alive. The only thing that I would think about is I'd have to be dried in some form. If I'm on a deserted island, I wouldn't be able to refrigerate. So I'm thinking of there'd have to be some sort of dried or processed meat.
That's interesting. The reason why I ask this question is because people get super analytical on it, and it's really fun to kind of hear different people's perspectives. Because when you have something that when I've had like guests that are not necessarily science like inclined, they just go by the first thing that comes to mind. They just go like Pop-Tarts or like stuff like that. But then I have like some people that, you and like I have the guy from like Steve Hall from Revive Stronger, like, literally kind of like going into like detail into like, I think this because of all the nutritional profile and everything like that. So it's great. Yeah. I feel like it kind of tells me more about the analytical brain that we have, especially as us, as like, either dietitians or nutrition experts. So that's awesome. Thank you. So we'll keep beef as like, your choice of food for the rest of your life. So that's a great one. So how can people find you, Livi? How can people reach out to you? I know you have a coaching program, to work one-on-one with you, or, how can literally people go and chat and have a conversation with you?
Sure. If you want to just find me, talk to me, I'm Livi Ron _RD on Instagram. My business Instagram is revival_wellness_nutrition. And then our website, if you wanted to check out our website or anything there, it's revivalwn.com.
Awesome.
I am the owner of Revival Wellness Nutrition.
Great. So if you want to go and if you want to learn about beef, horses, or nutrition specifically, or weightlifting, you need to go and check out Livi's social media's channel so you can have a conversation with her. Livi, it's been a pleasure to have you on here on VV Nutrition Radio. Hopefully we'll bring you back on so we can chat about other topics within nutrition, and we'll see how it goes from there. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You have been listening to VV Nutrition Radio. Couple of things before you take off. If you enjoyed this episode, please, I would love to get your feedback. So feel free to drop down a review, and I will be forever grateful. Also, if you like this podcast, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We have it on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play. And lastly, if you would like to receive a freebie from me, make sure you sign up for our newsletter at www.vive-nutrition.com. See you guys in the next episode. Ciao, ciao.